Olá a todos, muito boa tarde. Ainda está a entrar muita gente na sala. A professora Brigitte Weger-Schuster já aqui está. Eu vou começar por apresentar em português. Hi Brigitte, I will present firstly in Portuguese for the participants that are still entering in the room. Nós tivemos um número incrivelmente elevado de pessoas a quererem estar presentes, e o que é bom, que é muito positivo, mas superou muito as nossas expectativas. Vamos tentar que isto decorra da forma mais positiva. Para nós é uma grande honra e é um enorme prazer ter a professora Brigitte por todo a sua carreira na área da psicologia, particularmente na psicotraumatologia. A professora Brigitte foi presidente da Estudos do Stress Traumático, a STSS, creio que é a maior organização europeia que se dedica a estas questões. E a professora Brigitte também é ainda diretora do Departamento de Psicologia na Universidade de Viena, na Áustria, e é uma das maiores proeminentes investigadoras na área do trauma dentro da Europa. Ultimamente tem estado mais interessada nas complexidades associadas ao trauma complexo. E é mesmo uma enorme honra tê-la aqui. O CPTL, há 3 anos, organizou um congresso de psicologia do trauma e do luto, em que tentou reunir uma comunidade importante de psicólogos que trabalham nesta área em Portugal, que teve um convidado internacional. Entretanto, com a pandemia, tem sido impossível nós termos estes momentos mais de partilha e também de formação, muito para além daquilo que são as nossas formações específicas que vamos tendo, e por isso estamos a aproveitar este momento para ter aqui um contacto mais generalizado, e esperemos já no final deste ano começarmos a lançar a organização do segundo congresso, que supostamente deveria ter ocorrido no ano passado, e vai apenas decorrer, em princípio, ou no final deste ano ou no início do próximo, e que irá permitir também voltarmos a ter este espaço de discussão e de partilha entre profissionais. A professora Brigitte vai nos falar sobre trauma complexo em crianças e adolescentes, muito no fruto do desenvolvimento que ela tem feito nos últimos tempos, e com a adaptação de um novo instrumento para avaliar trauma complexo em crianças, e todas as expectativas que esta avaliação e o reconhecimento destes sintomas traz para a melhor proteção das crianças. E que foi uma adaptação que vem decorrente da evolução do chamado ICD-11, que agora traz guias orientadoras para que as crianças possam estar protegidas também ao nível da saúde mental, no que diz respeito ao trauma complexo, e que irá ser implementado, e está a ser implementado na maior parte dos países, o que é extremamente positivo, e que nos coloca também nós com uma capacidade boa de interpretar, reconhecer, avaliar, intervir sobre este tipo de problemáticas. So, Professor Brigitte, it is a pleasure to have you here. I was presenting you to our participants, Portuguese participants here, telling about your experience, about your fantastic curriculum, considering the career as a psychologist and working in the psychology department at the University of Vienna, and the whole research you have been doing. I was also telling our participants that usually we have a Portuguese Congress in psychology of grief and trauma, and the second Congress should be last year, but with the pandemic state that we are, we still didn't realize, didn't organize the second Congress, but we are expecting to do that. So we are initiating this cycle of webinars that we call Meaning Factory, that the idea came from Andy Warhol factory about art, and we are here trying to provide meaning for some very, very difficult events that happen to human beings, and today particularly related with children and adolescents, traumatic stress. And it is a pleasure to have you here. It's a really honor to have you here, considering the relevance that you have been having in the European arena in this area, which is really important. And I just want to, just before giving the voice to you, Brigitte, I just want to make some rules here. You all had the possibility to make questions. Sorry, I didn't tell that this in Portuguese. I will tell also in Portuguese the rules. Todos puderam colocar questões na inscrição, e foram colocadas algumas questões, e a professora Brigitte organizou a comunicação no sentido de responder essas questões. Contudo, o chat vai estar aberto, se vocês quiserem colocar questões e comentários, depois no final podemos abrir a sessão e podem colocar essas questões também. Okay? Now in English, just told the participants they made the questions in the description, and you know the questions, and I know you organized your presentation based on the questions participants made, and that will be okay. But probably some of you will have questions and comments to make in the course of this action, so you may use the chat. Chat will be open, and at the end we will have some time to have a more open discussion about it, but we are trying to end at Portuguese time at 4 o'clock, 16. We will try to do it, but probably we may have some delay considering the discussion and the difficulty of people entering. We already have 79% in this webinar, which is quite nice. Nice to have you all here, and I will give the word to Professor Brigitte now.
Okay. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for this invitation, which is definitely one of the most challenging invitations I've ever had, giving a webinar with almost half of the continent in between, from Austria to Portugal, under currently, I'm sure, very different living conditions, since Vienna is still under a complete lockdown, whereas you can already visit coffee shops and restaurants, as I have heard yesterday from another Portugal. So I hope you enjoy that. I would enjoy, I'm sure about. My deepest request to you is, whenever you have a problem in understanding my English, whenever you want to comment on what I say, just let me know. I think it's more important to have the dialogue than bringing over the screen everything I have prepared. That's you can read that everywhere. Okay, so I'm happy to talk with you about the complex trauma in children, adolescents, and adults. That's something that I have added when I've prepared. And as Jose, does it move? Has it moved now? Okay, thank you. And as you have heard already, that some questions were transferred to me, and this is how I grouped them, and this is how I grouped my presentation for you. And these questions is about complex trauma and complex PTSD, about the symptomatology of complex trauma in children, adolescents, and adults. This is why I have added the adults. Then it's about the ICD-11, CPTSD, and PTSD criteria. Then it's about the society and how to prevent maltreatment in children. Then we have 4 questions, which I'm not sure whether I will be able to answer it. And I would say about the grief-related questions, there is a lot to say. but I'm not sure whether we will have enough time for that. That would be great to do it as well, but I'm not so sure whether we have the time. It's only 1 hour. And the questions are very complex, and the whole issue is complex and not so easy to follow. Okay, I'll proceed. It's now about the symptomatological phenomenology of the complex trauma in children, adolescents, and adults. And in order to clarify that, we first of all need to know what is complex trauma so that we can relate with the responses, the reactions, or the symptoms. Complex trauma is, as you probably know, a multiple traumatic exposure, mostly a long-term exposure. So it doesn't happen only once, and it doesn't happen within a few days. It always takes quite some time. It's mostly about interpersonal violence, mostly about interpersonal violence between persons that know each other very well and mostly live together, which is characterizing childhood maltreatments. And it is also about neglect, as recent data from one of our studies showed very clearly, because neglect was related also with complex PTSD in this data. And of course, it implies a loss of resources. And again, I have my mistake, Jose, that I haven't seen here. Resources, it's only with one, sorry for that. And this is about problems to understand what is happening to a child once it is maltreated, once it is exposed to sexual violence. It is about loss of protection. It is about loss of a binding person, because the binding person is also the offending person. It's about distancing to the social environment, and it's about loss of social support. And all this impacts the developmental processes like emotion regulation, building trust in relation, having the possibility to develop a positive sense of self. And all this can be seen not as a gateway, but as a risk factor for CPTSD, as it is shown in the ICD-11. So complex trauma is a risk factor, but not a precondition in order to have a complex PTSD. And I think that's important to know that it is only a risk factor, but not a precondition as it is in other classification systems. About loss of resources, I think this is especially of relevance for children who were exposed to child maltreatment. And when I say child maltreatment, I include sexual violence, physical violence, emotional neglect, and physical neglect, as it is defined by the WHO. What does it mean, this loss of resources? First of all, it goes and damages and limits the internal resources in terms of cognitive and emotional developmental possibilities. This is stopped at a certain developmental level whenever it will happen. And it is also difficult for the kids to understand what it is, because mostly they are kind of kept under a secret between the offender and themselves, and they can't address anybody in order to say, well, this is what happened to me, tell me what it is. They just have this feeling, this irritation feeling that something is wrong, but they have no words for it mostly. So it's a problem of understanding, and of course, when a kid doesn't understand, a child doesn't understand what is happening to him or her, it's also about the external resources that starts to become limited in terms of no safe place, no social environment, no protective person. And of course, these resources are challenged with consequences for quite a lot of things. For instance, the capacity to find friends, to find positive relations, to develop trust in the perception of others, And all this is related with the limited developmental capacities that are kind of broken by child maltreatment processes. And I'm sure you know that most of the kids that survive child maltreatment feel stigmatized, they feel dirty, they shame, and they feel guilty. And that is why they do not look out for help. And when there is no help seeking, then there is no protection. And that's something that meets with the taboo in the society perfectly. And this is one of the reasons why child maltreatment is not a big issue in most of the societies. It's always a big issue when there is a scandal, but then it goes down. Yeah, and what we know is that the highest risk to become traumatized during childhood is given by closely related adults. I'm sure that's very familiar to you. In order to understand CPTSD in children and adolescents, there is, in my eyes, a need to understand CPTSD in other adults, since this is the starting point from the ICD-11 that was designed by the ICD Committee for Traumatic Stress Disorders and was headed by our colleague Andreas Merker from University of Zurich. What they have postulated at the beginning is, after having reviewed thousands of studies, that it is enough to have 6 symptoms and grouped in 3 factors to define PTSD, adapting a public health perspective. So it's not only about science, it's definitely about the global public health, and it should be clinically utile. Just it's easy to use. This was always the perspective that was guiding this group. So ICD-11 took a concept that was really simple, but was able to distinguish between basic and complex forms of the condition of PTSD, respectively complex PTSD. So we have a 3-factor structure for the PTSD and a 6-factor for complex PTSD. Complex PTSD consists of the 3 factors of PTSD plus 3 additional ones. And there is another precondition for the diagnosis, that is a greater functional impairment. And what we see from quite a lot of studies also in our data is that the ICD-11 prevalence for both PTSD and complex PTSD is lower than the DSM-5 prevalence in a variety of studies, and you will see why rather soon. And if there are already some questions, I'm very happy to answer them. I can't see it in the chat. I hope you can see it. So what you have on this slide is the structure or the classification definition of the ICD-11 PTSD and the complex PTSD. Of course, there is a need to be threatened by something, but not with a subjective anxiety response. There is no need to have this, what we had in DSM-4, the A2 criterion. They removed it. So yes, there should be something severe happening in the life in order to have the idea I could look out for PTSD or complex PTSD when I do the assessment of an individual. Then they clarified about the re-experiencing of the event, and they did it in a very strict way. They clarified what is an intrusive memory and what is the re-experiencing. And they decided, well, re-experiencing is that thing that should be present in an individual that has survived certain traumatic exposures in order to have a diagnosis. It's not the traumatic and intrusive memories, because you can find them also in depression, for instance. And then they said it's about avoidance. I think that's all very familiar to you. And they put an increased emphasis on the deliberate avoidance. And then they removed this very strict criterion of 4 weeks, as we had it in DSM-4, and said, well, at least there should be a duration for several weeks. So they took off this strict timeline, which is also very helpful. And it also helps us about the emphasis of the delayed onset of PTSD, something that we have seen in the studies very often, that we have done with adults of institutional, which have experienced institutional foster care here in Austria. And then they added the significant impairment that is necessary to disentangle from reactions to extreme stresses. Furthermore, then this is PTSD. And if you have in your interviews still a reaction that goes beyond that, you don't have to go through another classification or another psychological disorder. You can also search for effective regulation problems with a negative self-concept, and of course with interpersonal disturbances. When you remember everything that I have told you about the lost, and it's rather easy, and then you can disentangle from bereavement disorder, which is also helpful because bereavement follows a different dynamic compared to any trauma-related disorder. Next, this is DSM-4 and DSM-5. And you can see that DSM-4, and I don't go into detail on these slides. What you can see is that DSM-4 does have a tremendous amount of symptoms, and DSM-5 has even more. So this is definitely too long, and it never gives a clear picture on what is PTSD and complex PTSD, because with the DSM-4 criteria, you have 100,000 possibilities to assess PTSD, and that's definitely too much. This was a calculation that was done by Chris Bruin, who was one of the masterminds behind the ICD-11 classification. So forget about that, because then you have, when you use this, you have a very broad picture of PTSD, and you never get clear for which kind of treatment would be feasible for this person. Since I was asked to tell you a little bit about how to assess PTSD and complex PTSD according to the ICD-11, I went to our website, the Trauma Measures Global.com, where you will find all the measures, or most of the measures, also translated into Portuguese language. So you can access them. It's open access. Just go for it, and you will find all the publications as well. And this is how it starts. So it's necessary to identify experiences that have been troublesome. And then it goes into the adult PTSD, and there are 2 questions for the re-experiencing. It's about upsetting dreams related to the experience, and that's definitely a difference to what we had before, powerful images or memories that come up and in which you feel as you were again in this situation. Only 2 items, but they definitely ask for a clear reaction on re-experiencing. It's not about traumatic memories, it's about clearly related dreams and feeling as if you were again in this traumatic situation. Then it's about avoiding internal reminders of the experiencing, of the experience. So you definitely have a bodily sensation that is connected with it. And avoiding external reminders like being in places that are similar or the same, or meeting people that have tortured or harassed a person. Could be also places, conversations, objects. That is still a broad spectrum possible. And then it's about the hyperarousal or the feeling of threat. And this is also limited to 2 items, being super alert, watchful, or on guard, and feeling jumpy or easily started. When you remember what was in the DSM-4, then it was also the question about can't sleep, can't concentrate. These are also symptoms that might be related to depression, and this is why they kind of kicked them out. Then I told you it's about functional impairment, and you can see the P7, P8, and P9 formulations. It's about relationship and social life, ability to work, or other important parts in a life, such as parenting, schooling, college work, or other important activities. This is PTSD. If you want to check out for complex PTSD, then it's necessary to apply the next 3 components. It's the affect dysregulation. When I'm upset, it takes me a long time to calm down, or I feel numb or emotionally shut down. Negative self-concept, a formulation like I feel like a failure or I feel worthless. And the next one and last one is disturbances in relationship, distant or cut off from other people, or it's hard to stay emotionally close to people. From this list of items, only 1 per factor needs to be answered positively, and then you have PTSD, respectively complex PTSD. So that's really easy to screen. These are the questions from the screening tool. And for the children, it's a reformulation of the same factors and the same questions, but more in the child version. And what we have done is we have applied these items in children living currently in foster care, being aged 10 to 18. And it works. It's definitely feasible to work with these items in a group of children that live in foster care. And I think maybe it's the same in your country, in Austria, when children are in foster care, in institutional foster care, then they do have also mostly some cognitive deficits, and they do understand these items. And I think that's an important message. It's applicable, it's utility, and it's easy for them to follow these questions. And I don't read this in detail. The next question you gave to me, are there any ICD-11 CPTSD and PTSD criteria that you would like to see changed? Yes, there are. So these are again the adult items. And I would add an item about very vivid memories and repeated thoughts related to trauma, because we have found this in adult survivors of institutional childhood abuse quite often, and we have compared their re-experiencing symptoms from ICD-10 with ICD-11. Quite a lot of them have lost the assessment of being PTSD or complex PTSD, let's say, positive. So, and this is a discussion that is ongoing also in the ICD-11 group. I'm not sure whether this group that wants to add this item will have a chance, but I'm lobbying for it. Some of these items are not nicely formulated. This is why, for instance, P9, I would like to disentangle because there is a lot of things inside and that could irritate people when they try to answer. And this is also the case for the C2 item, which is feeling numb or emotionally shut down. So these are two levels and people don't know to which question they have to answer. And the same is done for children. When you look into children that have problems in articulating, in explaining verbally what happened to them, you can watch them play traumatic games. These repeating the traumatic situation they have survived. So it might be good to add traumatic play, especially for younger children, when they don't have words to say what happened to them. And again, I'd prefer to disentangle the one or other item and put it at least in 2 sentences, since the formulation is not really good. But we will see what will happen, since this is quite new. I don't know. We started to work with it, I think, 2 years ago, and we had been the first ones that applied it in a study. So my next question that I was given was a really hard question, because it's what us as scientists, clinical psychologists, human rights activists, child protection activists, always moves is how to change the world to a better place and to a safer place when such bad things happen. And one way is, of course, to demonstrate on the streets, ask for freedom, justice, and so on. And the other way is, and this is the way I know better to do, is to do my work. So my suggestion would be do studies, promote results, support survivors with the results in the sense of empowerment, and learn about trauma and disseminate your knowledge wherever you are. And this is what we have tried to do. And I'll show you very briefly an example of what we have done in order to change a little bit the society. And definitely we succeeded in Austria in changing a little bit into a little bit better. This is a study that we have done from 2014 till 2019. Can't remember exactly. It was about child abuse and neglect in institutional foster care settings, cumulative lifetime traumatization, and adult survivors' mental health. These had been adults that had been in foster care, in institutional foster care, as children, and this was starting from the 1950s till the 1990s. So this was really a huge population. We have compared it also with a control group from Viennese people. And one day, the funding institution, which was the Austrian Fund, the Science Fund, had the idea to promote us in the media. And we got quite a lot of reactions, and this is what you can see. So I only put some into that, that really promoted the study and made big eyes to politicians, to lawyers, but also to those who were affected, to the survivors, because we already had contact with them. And it helped them to say, well, I'm part of this group that was a former foster care or institutional foster care kid. They called themselves Heimkinder. I'm sorry not to have a proper translation for the term they gave themselves. It says, well, I'm a kid that lived in institutional foster care. don't know how to make that smaller. So this study was promoted, and this is a little bit how it looked. We wanted to just go into the topic box. We wanted to show specific patterns of institutional abuse and the risk factors. We wanted to show the long-term effects and psychological consequences. We failed in showing that the cortisol levels, but that's not so severe. We wanted to show specific patterns of institutional abuse and the current mental health status, which is of high relevance. And we wanted to compare all this with a control group from the Viennese population, stratified. We had access to the documents for the juvenile protection institutions from those days, so we definitely digged into archives. We did a lot of quantitative interviewing and also some qualitative in-depth interviews. I don't know how it was in Portugal, but in Austria in 2010, a kind of scandal popped up, which was related with the Catholic Church and what they have done to children who were under their care. And this Catholic Church scandal just moved over any institution who took care for children. So our first study was a study on the survivors of the Catholic Church. We named it Survivors of the Catholic Church, and then we proceeded with survivors of Viennese foster care institutions, where more than 2,700 individuals approached an organization that was created to redress them in order to ask them whether they would be able and willing to participate in our study. Finally, Vienna paid 17,000 euros per case to the survivors, where there was an evidence that they had been in these institutions. And what happened all over Austria, and this is when our study definitely has to change the world from the survivors, is that they got free of taxes and free of security, an additional monthly, a monthly amount of 300 euros, because we could show with our data that they had also a huge financial gap between the control group and themselves. So we managed that they get unconditionally 300 months extra, 300 euros a month extra till the end of their life. And of course, I had a lot of press conferences and I had a lot of enemies, but I had also a lot of new friends in this situation, and definitely it helped. I don't go into this, I just show you what we have started on. In the time when we started, we had 1,984 who were already registered as foster care survivors. And from this, we finally ended up with 220. So most of them had been very, very shy to give interviews. And we compared them with a stratified comparison group from the Viennese population. And this had been 234. And we ended up in a little bit more than 450 participants in this study. So this is where the data comes from. We had quite a lot of measures, so this was really hard time also for the survivors to answer all these questions, because it a little bit moved them back in what happened to them. And any interview you do with a survivor is also always triggering not PTSD, it's not trauma, re-traumatization, but of course it brings you in a level of reflecting yourselves. And this is the stress that is related with any kind of interview you do with survivors. When you look into the results, and I just marked in orange the differences between the foster care group and the comparison group, we had in the foster care group less ladies, because this sample is male dominated. More young boys are still today in foster care, in institutional foster care. This was also in those days. You see that most of them had been in their 60s when you look in the age, and there was definitely a huge gap in the academic attainments. The foster care group had much lesser education and training than any other comparison group we had found in Vienna. So, all these participants were Vienna based. So out of this, you can see that their career, how you say that the educational career was limited due to the fact that they had been in foster care. And this is still the case when you look in samples of kids that are currently in Austria in institutional foster care. 50% of them don't go in the normal schooling system, but in a school system for children with some intellectual disabilities. And of course, this has a lifetime impact. And I'm not sure whether all these kids that are currently in these schools should go there. What you can see here is when you read the last, let me try to point into that, yeah. Intrafamiliar is one level. Here you have never, sometimes, and very often. Here you have the foster care group, and here you have the comparison group, and the colors indicate which type of abuse they have experienced. And it's about emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect in those types. And what you see here is that there is definitely a significant difference between the foster care group and the comparison group. And there is a significant difference for those foster care kids that also had been abused before they were put into foster care. So they have disadvantages starting from the beginning of their life. And this is still the case for current kids living in institutional foster care. We did a very strict calculation of lifetime events in adulthood to compare foster care with the comparison group. And you also see here a difference in their exposure, a significant difference in their exposure. And what you see here is that makes an impact for the long-term mental health, a severe and definitely horrible impact for their lifetime. The silver is the foster care group, and you can see it in every disorder we have assessed with the structural clinical interview according to DSM-4. You see differences, huge differences. I don't go into details for that, but once you have this data and you publish this data also in a radio interview or in a news show or in what I have shown to you, Austrian papers or in other papers, then you have the attention, and this makes prevention, because this wakes up politicians or any kind of activism. I don't go into that because time is running. These are the limitations of our studies. It's cross-sectional, it's a very specific sample, but it definitely shows that these people do have quite a lot of problems till now, starting with a lower socioeconomic background. Child abuse experiences before the foster care placement and in the foster care placement elevated risk for re-victimization in adulthood and a high prevalence of current and lifetime mental disorders, I think that's enough in order to protect the children. That's definitely a wonderful, in brackets, a wonderful argument to say, well, protect our children, teach our parents how to live with their children. Yeah. This was my answer to question number 3. The question number 4 is about forensic of CPTSD, and well, it was announced that the ICD-11 will be put in practice in 2018. Now they have announced that it will be 2020, so we don't have yet some experiences with it. But I'm sure that we will have the debate, as we have it always when we are in front of the court with any survivors. It's about causality. Specifically, when a survivor has had also child maltreatment. Because this is always the question. When it comes to money, most of the lawyers say, well, this is not causal because this was in childhood, and whatever happened by then is an extra event or is an extra reaction. It's not related. And this is why I have shown you the results of the Vienna foster care study, because here we showed, well, there is a relation. It's not causal, but it's a conditional relation. If this child would not have been in foster care during his childhood, then it would have made a different career and lifetime, and would have a different biography compared to children who have never been exposed to childhood maltreatment and foster care. Yeah. I don't go into that because we only have 12 minutes left. This is just to show you, it's about ISDSS, it's the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, their recommendations for treatment of CPTSD. And what they do is, based on huge research in treatments with very strict methods, they recommend CPT, any kind of cognitive therapy, EMDR. I have seen the EMDR logo somewhere on the screen. It's about individual CPT with trauma focus and, of course, prolonged exposure. These are the therapeutic methods that definitely make a difference in terms of symptom reduction and mitigation of all that's on the loads of the survivors. I've put on this slide also the place where you could download that and read it by yourself, because it's a huge document. One has 32 pages, the others are rather small. It's just that you are informed. This can be done also by you. And what I think as emerging intervention, which is of high relevance, is the virtual reality therapy, because this can be done from remote places where no clinicians are given. And this is, at least for Austria, very relevant in the Alps, because the psychosocial care in the western part of Austria, in the mountain part of Austria, it's not so, so intense as it is here in Vienna. For children, ISDSS recommends CBT as well. There is a huge study going on in Germany run by Rita Rosner. She did a lot of RCTs in CPT for children, and now she does a dissemination study whether the CPT that is evidence-based is also feasible to be applied by clinicians that are in private practice. Still no results, because this study suffers a lot from the COVID situation. It's also promising to have a group CPT for children and EMDR when there is a special training for EMDR with kids. I don't know how this is given in Portugal, and I even don't know how it is in Austria. But I suppose EMDR children trainings should be possible. Please also look at the insufficient evidence to recommend. That doesn't say it doesn't help, but it doesn't help enough. It's maybe stabilizing, but it's not reducing the symptoms. And I think all we want to do is giving back life, and that is being symptom-free. Here you can download these papers. And this is University of Vienna, our main building. I'm not situated there, but it's just to show you how beautiful traveling would be and will be once we can go again there. So thank you for listening to me. And I'm very happy to hear your comments, questions and answers.
Fantastic, Brigitte. Thank you for all explanations and all information you provide us. Really important to understand what was behind some of the decisions concerning the differentiating of intrusive symptoms and re-experiencing memories. All those aspects are very, I think our memories about CPTSD will get rooted in the stronger way, having your own experience here of what happened behind the scenes, because usually we only see the papers and the results, and you explain here the reasons and the discussions that sometimes we are not so inside those discussions,
Yeah.
and that's very,
I
very
was
important.
not inside that.
But
I was going to those people who were the inner circle and said, well, I have data.
Yeah.
And I have a wonderful team. We could provide you some data and some analysis, and this is how I came into that. So just go for them.
Yes,
yeah,
that's really important, because people are really much more open to dialogue and to discuss and and that's what you have done here. You opened your own experience to the Portuguese clinicians and researchers that are here. And that's really good to Europe is big, but it's not so big. We can meet each other, we can communicate. Our English is not perfect. We are not native. We are not native. We speak Portuguese. Brigitte speaks German, Austrian primarily, and it's naturally, and it's much easier to speak English with non-native, I think so. So I'd open a bit of time to have more comments and discussion. I don't know if someone wants to have any specific questions about CPTSD in children, treatment.
Well, I have a question for you, Brigitte.
okay.
Regarding the CPTSD and PTSD, the 11 criteria, you talked a bit about the impairment criteria, but I'm not I couldn't quite understand if you think that it's a good criteria to have, or if it's
a
criteria that might be
criteria to have, because it really indicates there is how you say, there is a need for supports and treatments when you have a functional impairment. And what are symptoms? I don't know if you have a symptom and you're not impaired. I don't know what it is then.
Yeah, I'm asking because we had some experience with a sample of victims that had high levels of exposure to traumatic events, and most times they couldn't quite understand their own impairments, and they would show us the symptoms in clinical observation and also in the instruments they filled, but they will also most times leave the impairment apart, and
Kind of
it made
not,
it
they are
made
not
the-
aware of
Yeah.
the impairment, the connection
Okay.
between the impairment and
Yeah.
the traumatization.
and
Yeah,
it made
but
diagnosis
the
very hard.
definition, they are impaired. It's just that they can't relate.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
this is why it is so important to ask for the impairment, for the functional impairment. And this gives you a pathway for psychoeducation. Did you ever think that your functional impairment, well, I wouldn't name it functional impairment when I'm talking with clients, is related to what happened to you in childhood or in wartime or as a refugee or as a torture survivor and so on. Yeah?
Yeah.
And this is why I would say functional impairment is of high relevance.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question in chat that is asking if after the session you will be able to give us
Provide
your
you-
email. Maybe someone wants to contact you about maybe instruments. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I just write it. It's a very long email address.
Okay,
So
it's
that says
That it is.
UniV is University of Vienna, AC Academy, AT Austria, plus my name.
and also Brigitte usually is very active and present and in the European Congress of Traumatic Stress Studies. That we probably next year, I don't know if it is already in Northern Ireland, I think, will be the next Congress. And I'm pretty sure we will find you there. And I hope many Portuguese researchers and clinicians can visit that event and being with you personally. But usually the European arena on traumatic stress studies meets usually, but with the coronavirus pandemic, it's more difficult to find a way to meet each other. But I'm pretty sure next year we will. I'm hoping.
And, maybe ESTSS might come also to Porto. We had a small idea about that. Working on the ICD, doing workshops in that. Well, that's still, we don't know how pandemic will develop, but
Yes.
I think
we are very open to receive the international community of clinicians and researchers in this area, and it is very good to have this kind of events here to increase also the awareness, because I think these events also improve the general awareness and from the clinicians, from the researchers, from the academics, from the general population. And I think we are moving in the good direction. And it has been very positive to have events also that we can disseminate knowledge and open the instrument as the International Trauma Consortium has made it. I understand that you have a very important role in that consortium, and that's very good. That we share the website of that consortium. Our team also is collaborating with this consortium in translating and adapting instruments, and we are also working on ITQ, International Trauma Questionnaire for children, now in Portuguese. We are very pleased with that. We have been working more with grief and bereavement in the past, but we still work with narrative therapies. But we are working also with the instruments, because with assessment we can recognize, we can discuss, we can make research, we can make RCTs, we can develop new interventions, new knowledge about this area, and that's what makes us providing meaning for those terrible experiences that children, adolescents, and adults had lived in the past. Because we are providing good solutions and the recognition of the suffering that is related with it. And about Andrea's question, which is typically very frequent, people are not aware of the real impact that traumatic stress and complex trauma has in the development. It is really important to increase that awareness in general population also, and in our patients particularly, because sometimes they don't recognize that burden was related with the experience they have. Thank you.
Yeah, this is also something that we have experienced in all the studies. Whenever we did the interviews with all the instruments we have applied, all the assessment, and they said, "Oh, now I understand what happened to me and why I feel so strange." And this made them move in the first step into treatment. And we moved a lot of people into treatment with our studies. This is also something to make the world a little bit better. A little bit, but at least.
We hope so.
Yeah.
Brigitte, thank you very much for your
Thank you
openness
for
and
listening and for the invitation.
it's a
Next
pleasure.
time I'll come. I can't stay in
Portugal,
Vienna.
I hope so.
I bought a plane and come and would be happy
Okay.
to see you. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, bye.
Bye.